system in the world doesn't work. That's fine. This is working.
Do I need to
No, you don't have to do anything. No, you don't have to do anything. Just that.
this one?
Take
A
that,
little bit.
plug it in the middle.
Okay.
That's fine. This is now. Okay, thanks. I'd like to thank you all for coming. My name is Steve McInerney. I'm the Executive Director of the Project on Middle East Democracy, or POMED. Before we get started, I'd just like to briefly thank the other 7 organizations that have joined forces with us to host today's event: the Committee to Protect Journalists, Freedom House, the Freedom Initiative, Human Rights First, Human Rights Watch, PEN America, and Win Without War. And we're very, very proud to work with all of them to put on today's event. I wish I could say that the occasion for today's event was a happy one or something to be celebrated, but I have to acknowledge up front that that's not the case. As you all know, the event that today's discussion will focus on is President Biden's first trip to the Middle East this week. He will visit Israel and the West Bank for 2 days beginning on Wednesday. He will then move on to Jeddah, Saudi Arabia, where he will meet not only with the King and Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, but also with the rulers of 8 other Middle Eastern countries, Arab countries, all but one of those being sort of authoritarian dictatorships. This trip, just speaking frankly, I believe is a mistake. And I think it sends a really terrible signal about this administration's policy approach to the region. I also believe that it's a betrayal of numerous promises made by President Biden while campaigning in 2020 to change course in the Middle East and to kind of re-emphasize in a new way the rights of the citizens in the region, and to steer away from the unconditional support for the region's brutal autocratic dictators that has marked U.S. policy for many years. Sadly, this trip sends the opposite signal of that. There's been a lot of discussion in recent days about this trip. There's also been a lot of criticism of it, including numerous articles arguing that Biden should not visit Saudi Arabia. And I wanted to point to one article in particular, one op-ed that was published over the weekend, that I think does a really excellent job of highlighting just how weak the case is for Biden to visit Saudi Arabia to meet with dictators from across the Arab world. And that is the op-ed published by the Washington Post on Saturday, written by President Biden himself, entitled "Why I'm Going to Saudi Arabia." I think the entire article sort of relies on kind of myths and falsehoods and lays out that this administration really lacks compelling reasons for Biden to visit Saudi Arabia and to basically make nice with dictators. Without going into too much detail, the first 2/3 of President Biden's op-ed tries to argue that things in the Middle East and North Africa are going well now, are going better, moving in a positive direction since he took office, and he tries to attribute that positive trajectory to his administration's policies in the region. First, I can't emphasize enough how out of touch and preposterous it sounds for him to be arguing that things in the region are going well or generally improving. I just returned a few weeks ago from a trip to the region. I speak every day with friends, colleagues, and partners across the region, and the mood across the region is bleak. Things are moving in a very negative direction politically. Numerous countries are facing extreme economic crises. This administration has rhetorically emphasized the importance of the global struggle against authoritarianism and for democracy. I would note that when Biden took office, there was one democracy remaining in the Arab world from the historic Arab Spring uprisings a decade earlier, in Tunisia. Sadly, Tunisia is no longer a democracy. That has happened since Biden took office. I would also note that Tunisia was not among the many countries mentioned in his op-ed about the region and how things are going positively. The last third of his op-ed tries to argue that going to Saudi Arabia to make nice with dictators will help keep the U.S. strong and secure. But this contradicts everything that we've learned about the relationship between repressive dictatorships and security and stability, including views expressed eloquently by President Biden himself on numerous occasions, including at his speech at the UN General Assembly last September, and also his speech in opening the Democracy Summit in December. He pledged at that Democracy Summit to work with democracies around the world to combat authoritarianism, and he pledged that this year would be a year of action on behalf of democracy and human rights. And instead, we're seeing him now go and make nice with 8 dictators that he will meet on Friday. It's very discouraging. In his op-ed, he notes that, quote, my friend King Abdullah of Jordan recently referred to the, quote, new vibe in the region. And to me, this is such an indictment of this administration and the way that it views the region, referring to a corrupt dictator as his friend. It reminds me of former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton referring to Hosni Mubarak as a friend of her family not long before he was overthrown in the revolution in 2011, remarks that she had to backtrack from. I think it also highlights that if there is a positive vibe in the region, as King Abdullah said, it is among the rulers of the region, among the dictators, not among the people. And it is related to US policy in this administration. I think the repressive dictators across the region were very worried when Biden came into office, worried because of campaign promises he'd made, worried about his rhetoric promising to treat repressive dictators as pariahs and to change course. And they now feel relieved. And they now feel as though the U.S. this administration is not going to change course and is going to continue to provide them with support. This administration has spoken, very frequently about the global struggle against authoritarianism led by Russia and China. But I just want to note that they're doing nothing to change the fact that the world's #1 provider of weapons and arms to dictatorships globally is not Russia or China. It is our own government. And I think that this trip and these meetings with the rulers of Saudi Arabia and Egypt and Bahrain and numerous countries, other autocrats across the region on Friday, comes in the context of continued and even increasing support and arms sales. With that, I'd like to turn to our speakers for today. In just a few minutes, I'll introduce 3 outstanding speakers from the region, voices from the region that we are very proud to have helped bring to Washington to speak at this event and engage in other meetings this week. But before turning to the activists from the region, I'd like to introduce Congressman Jim McGovern. Congressman McGovern has long been, absolutely one of the most important, outspoken, committed voices supporting human rights globally in the Congress. He serves as the co-chair of the Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission in the House, and it's really my pleasure to introduce him now. Congressman.
Well, thank you, Stephen, and good afternoon, everyone. And my thanks to the Project on Middle East Democracy, Human Rights Watch, PEN America, the Freedom Initiative, Freedom House, Committee to Protect Journalists, Win Without War, and Human Rights First for inviting me to say a few words here today. I'm also honored to be here with this distinguished panel, who will be a lot more interesting than me. So I won't take very long here. But to all these organizations, let me just say I've followed all of your work for a very long time, and I deeply appreciate your demonstrated commitment to human rights and democracy at home and abroad. And I share Stephen's apprehension about the President's visit to the Middle East, specifically to Saudi Arabia. Let us all hope that a central focus of that visit will be on human rights. If I were the advisor, I would not be advising him to do this trip the way he's doing it, but I will say this, I prefer him as president than his predecessor, because I do remember Mr. Trump's visit to Saudi Arabia, which I found particularly offensive. I also think for all of us who care about human rights issues, especially in the Middle East, we have to acknowledge that we need to continue to build a stronger bipartisan consensus on how to deal with some of these countries. I think we need to insist even more strongly about the need for human rights to be a central part of our foreign policy. And as somebody who is the co-chair of the Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission, I also sit on the China Commission. Members of Congress and administrations over the years are selective as to where their outrage is on human rights matters, and I think we need to insist on more consistency. But let me begin here by recognizing the courage that it takes to stand up for human rights in the Middle East. There is not a single country in the region where the right to defend the fundamental freedoms of expression, association, and belief is fully guaranteed. But defending human rights in the Middle East exposes people to the risks of stigmatization, threats, harassment of family members, torture, prolonged imprisonment, deportation, loss of nationality, even death and dismemberment. We have seen case after case in country after country. The three incredible women who will speak shortly know all too well what it takes to defend human rights in the Middle East and the costs that it brings. And I'm honored to be joining them today. As I said, I serve as the Democratic co-chair of the Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission in the House. And one of the things the Commission does is coordinate the Defending Freedoms Project, which allows members of Congress to advocate on behalf of prisoners of conscience around the world. A prisoner of conscience is somebody who has been deprived of freedom for exercising their human rights. These are people who are in jail for speaking out, organizing, protesting, doing journalism, or similar activities. Sometimes they have directly criticized political or religious leaders or governmental policies. Other times their mere existence is all it took to land them in trouble. And all too often, these individuals are accused of terrorism with no evidence at all. Countries all around the world are using terrorism as an excuse to crack down on their political opponents or people who say things they don't like. Prisoners of conscience are people who never should have been imprisoned in the first place. More than a third of Defending Freedoms cases that the Commission is currently tracking are from the Middle East and Northern Africa. They include Ismail Alexandrani, an Egyptian journalist detained since 2015. Haitam Mohammed, an Egyptian labor activist and human rights lawyer detained since 2018. Walid Abdul Kahir, a Saudi human rights lawyer in prison since 2014. Before his arrest, he represented another prisoner of conscience, Raif Badawi, who was finally released 4 months ago, but remains subject to a travel ban. I hope the president will bring that case up and say he should be able to go wherever he wants to go. Abdulhadi al-Khawaja, a well-known human rights defender in Bahrain, who was once the regional representative for frontline defenders, but now is serving a life sentence. He is the father of Mariam al-Khawaja, who will speak shortly. Abdijalidas Case, a Bahraini engineer, a blogger, and human rights activist, detained since 2011 and also serving a life sentence. This is not a full list by any means. And over the weekend, as we mentioned, President Biden wrote that he is traveling to the Middle East to, quote, start a new, more promising chapter of America's engagement and advance important American interests. He insisted that human rights and fundamental freedoms will be on his agenda. I believe in engagement, so I hope all that is true. But it should be true because protecting human rights is an important American interest, as the President himself has said many times. But protecting human rights cannot be just about words. It has to be about actions. You know, it doesn't take a lot of courage for U.S. politicians, no matter what party we may be part of, to talk the talk It takes a little bit more courage to walk the walk, and we need to walk the walk more. We need to see prisoners of conscience freed. We need to see space open up for human rights advocates to speak out, write, organize, and protest without fear of being thrown in jail. We need journalists to be able to do their jobs without ending up in jail or shot dead. We need to see protections for human rights that are built into law and institutions, not just dependent on the whims of monarchs. So I'll be looking for progress on these fronts to come from the President's trip. And I hope and pray that he delivers. In the meantime, it is important for us to raise our voices. It is important for us to try to hold our elected officials accountable and to demand more. I've always believed that if the United States stands for anything, we need to stand out loud and foursquare for human rights. When we do, I think that is our country at its best. When we don't, it is our country at its worst. There are people around the world who are counting on us to do more, to be stronger, to be better, and I hope that we will. So thank you all for being here. Thank you so much for being part of this panel. I'll turn this back over to Stephen. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Congressman Governor, for your excellent remarks and for your continued commitment to supporting human rights abroad, including in the Middle East and North Africa. Now I'd like to introduce our three outstanding speakers from the region. All three of them, I think, appear kind of in at least two capacities, with at least two hats. All of them are distinguished activists and important voices from the region. In addition to that, all three of them have close family members who are activists who are either are currently imprisoned under brutal conditions, or in one case was, not that long ago released from prison, but remains under harsh conditions that we'll get into. And I just want to commend the courage of all of our speakers in the work that they do and in their willingness to kind of join us and speak publicly about not only their family members and their cases, but also the much broader conditions that those cases, individual cases, kind of represent. Our first speaker will be Lina El-Hathlul. She's a distinguished defender of human rights from Saudi Arabia. Her sister Loujain El-Hathlul is one of Saudi Arabia's most important human rights activists, and she has suffered greatly for her activism. Loujain was abducted in the UAE in March 2018 and taken to Saudi Arabia, where she was imprisoned under brutal conditions, including torture, for 3 years until she was released in March 2021. She remains today under travel ban, unable to kind of speak or work freely inside the kingdom. Her family members who are in Saudi Arabia also remain under travel ban, and not only her family but also other colleagues and associates have been targeted since her release as a kind of method of intimidation and effort to control Loujain. Loujain was, prior to her arrest, was widely known for many admirable acts of activism, including being one of the first women to kind of openly defy the ban on women driving in Saudi Arabia. Our second speaker will be Sana Saif. Sana is an Egyptian activist and filmmaker, and she's also the sister of Abdel Fattah. Ala is one of Egypt's most prominent and respected human rights activists. He was one of the faces of Egypt's inspiring 2011 revolution. He has been in prison numerous times, and currently he's been in prison since September 2019, held in brutal conditions, and he's currently on hunger strike. And yesterday marked the 100th day of his hunger strike. And then our third speaker will be Mariam Khawajah. Mariam is a Bahraini human rights defender. I've had the pleasure of knowing Mariam, I believe, since 2009. She's been she and her entire family have been important voices in the Bahraini human rights community for decades. Her father, Abdijalidas Case, has been one of the most prominent human rights activists in Bahrain for decades, and he's been in prison since April 2011, and he is also held in brutal conditions and currently has been denied medical care, and their family, and all of the organizations putting on this event today called for all of these individuals to be released, and also for him to, in this case, to be released on humanitarian grounds. He's also a dual citizen, holding Danish citizenship, and we would love to see him released to Denmark. With that, I will turn now to Lena for remarks.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Hello? Can you hear me? Can you hear me? Yeah? Okay. So good afternoon, everyone. I'm Lena Al-Hadloul. I am now an activist myself, but I'm also the sister of Dujain Al-Hadloul, a prominent human rights defender who was in prison for 1,001 days in Saudi and who was released last year. And so just after her release, President Biden applauded her release, stating that it was the right thing to do to release her. And she was actually the first Saudi name he pronounced after being president, even before the king or Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman. And of course, I mean, this followed positive campaign promises the president had as a candidate. He had promised to make Saudi Arabia a pariah and to distance himself from Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, MBS. So now we are over a year later, and President Biden announces a trip to Saudi Arabia. And of course, it followed with concerns and questions. Will he be meeting MBS? What the content of the discussions will be, etc., etc. So now President Biden made it clear that he will be meeting MBS with the caveat, as he calls it, that it will be in a room full of people and it's not a one-on-one meeting. The comment I have on that is that it doesn't depend, I mean, it's not about the intention President Biden has when he goes there and meets MBS. It's about what the consequences will be once he goes there and be in the same room as MBS. What the regime will make of that visit. It will be perceived as a big win for MBS, and it will be mentioned as such. As you know, I mean, I don't want to get into too much politics, but MBS has no legitimacy whatsoever. And the thing is that he did a coup in Saudi Arabia, supported by the Trump administration. The people in Saudi Arabia did not elect him. The royal family did not choose him. And the only thing that made him take power is the fact that the Trump administration was there to support him. So the US has leverage. That's the main point. So now that President Biden is going to meet him, it will unquestionably empower, embolden MBS. And of course, it will bring the legitimacy he is lacking. The other point is that President Biden justifies this visit for the stability in the Middle East. I will say that this is not what stability looks like for me as a Saudi citizen. I don't want a country that is governed by someone who tortures women, including my sister, someone who cuts journalists into pieces, someone who starts wars all over the region, in Yemen, diplomatic crisis in Qatar, imprisons the prime minister of Lebanon, and of course the list goes on. And so by enabling MBS, we are indeed creating a new Putin, I'm sorry to say it, a new dictator that is impulsive, unpredictable, and who will be unstoppable if we do not do anything about it now. So after all these negative thoughts, what is there to do now? The point is for the international community to use the leverage it has to slow down the process of empowering MBS, and this is done by having clear demands. So when in Saudi Arabia, President Biden has to demand the release of all political prisoners, including Abdurrahman al-Sadhan, Lina al-Sharif, Walid Abu al-Khair, Hassan al-Malki, and Salman al-Auda. The end of restrictions on human rights defenders and their families, because now there are collective punishments, including travel bans on my sister Lujain and my family. And more than these concessions, if President Biden truly wants stability in the region, he must hear the people's voices that are not included in the op-ed. And this can't be done without civil society. And as civil society has been silenced inside of the country, it's important to meet with the people who gathered in the diaspora and who are trying to build a real reform in the country and a new Saudi Arabia. And so I really, truly hope that next time President Biden goes to Saudi Arabia, he takes on our call and meets with us to truly know what is needed for Saudi Arabia to reform at least and to improve its human rights record. And thank you. If you have any questions, I can answer them later on. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Lina. With that, I'd like to turn to Sana.
Thank you for having me. I will mainly focus about my brother's case because it's urgent, and maybe leave the general politics to you guys. My brother Abdel Fattah, he's 40. He is a British Egyptian writer, pro-democracy, secular activist. He is one of the many prominent, he is basically the most prominent prisoner of conscience in Egypt. And he's now serving a 5-year sentence for sharing a Facebook post. There is no reason for us to believe that if he finishes the sentence, which is supposed to end in 2027, that he will be released, because whenever he finishes the sentence, they just put him on a new case, and all that is being communicated to us as a family, either through unofficial interrogations with security agencies when I was in prison, or through people who were close to the regime who tried to raise the issue directly with President al-Sisi, is that the plan is for Alaa to stay in prison. Why? Why would people high up in the regime want Alaa particularly to be in prison? Because they used him to set an example, and in return he was resilient. In return, the family, us, we were vocal, so they punished us, so they put me in prison for speaking up about my brother, and so we turned into a symbol for others. The challenge I always face with my brother, it's unlike many other cases. When I tried to advocate for my brother, and I came here to DC 2 months ago to advocate for my brother, I thought I would need to create a strong argument. I need to get sympathy. And then I realized that every official I meet with is already probably briefed about my brother, is already probably sympathetic, but my brother's case is not being raised on high level because everybody knows Sisi's personal about it, and so he's like a big fish. We won't raise his case. It's not because they don't believe that he's a prisoner of conscience. It's not because there is not an understanding that this is a bottleneck kind of case, that if it was resolved, it will result in helping many others, but because of the fact that it is personal with the president. Thankfully, we were lucky that we recently acquired British citizenship. We realized that we were eligible, we just didn't know because my mom was born in London. And I thought that since we've got this British citizenship, that finally this could be a game changer. And I started advocating for my brother again. And because now there is a face-saving solution. Sisi doesn't need to pardon him or let him go. He can just extradite him, send him to London, handcuffs and all, as a criminal. And even then, I started advocating for my brother here in DC, but also in Europe. And I'm always faced with the same, it's the elephant in the room. Sorry, your brother is too high of a profile for us to raise. Which is, to me, it doesn't make sense. You're the United States of America. You should you should raise high-profile cases. This is what you need to do. Even if you're not going to get those high-profile people out, you will get more people out. The situation in Egypt is very bad. It would take long to explain how bad it is, but there is a moment of opportunity now, because for some reason, Sisi cares about creating PR, making PR, and claiming that he's improving human rights conditions. Egypt is hosting the UN climate conference in November, and it's not being prepared for as if it's a climate dialogue. It's being prepared for as if it's the next World Cup. It is the biggest PR move for Sisi. And President Biden has been avoiding meeting with or having calls with Sisi for a very long time, which really means a lot to the Egyptian president. And I really worry about this trip now, because the moment they have this bilateral meeting, even if it's a quick handshake, this footage will be played over and over again inside Egypt. And that's it. You just sleepwalked into his PR campaign. Why? Why do that now while you have leverage to raise cases and to get us wins and some human rights improvements without changing anything about like the big politics of things? It's just on the cosmetics level. Why participate in their PR whitewashing propaganda without any price in return? I came here 2 months ago. I was faced with this challenge that nobody really believes there is a way out for my brother, and so his case is not being brought up on high level. And so I went back to London and I started campaigning, and we as a family started campaigning, and now we have really shown proof that there is a way out for Ale. On June 21st, the British Foreign Secretary Liz Truss confirmed before Parliament that she's working very hard to secure his release. Prime Minister Boris Johnson raised it twice with the president, with the Egyptian president, Sisi. Ale was transferred to a relatively better facility. He still denied some of his basic rights, but he was transferred to a relatively better facility. The Egyptian Minister of Foreign Affairs, Sameh Shoukry, came to London on July 2nd, and he had bilateral meetings, and negotiation around my brother's case started. There is an opportunity here to release Ale, but Ale is a high-profile case. It's a bottleneck kind of case where we need a unified front from our Western allies. And we're not asking for much. We're asking for people to raise his case. We're not asking you to stop your arm deals or stop how you go about your business. We're asking just on the side of going about your business, just mention those names, those high-profile names, because those are the ones who will matter with a larger number of people. So I'm here to urge President Biden to raise my brother's case in the trip. We have never been as close to getting Ale out of prison or completely losing him as we are right now. Ale has been living on a bit of skim milk or a spoon of honey in his tea for 101 days, which is like 5% of the normal calorie intake for a human being. He's not going to stop his strike. He's not going to break it, so he's either going to be released or he's going to die in prison. And thank you.
Thank you, Sana. Turn to Mary.
Thank you. It's always difficult to follow a testimony like that. I think generally when we're talking about President Biden's visit to the Middle East region, it's important to remember what happened specifically to Bahrain after the last time a US president met with the King of Bahrain. That was President Trump in 2017. Within 48 hours, 5 protesters were killed in one of the deadliest attacks since 2011, after riot police attacked a sit-in that had been happening for a couple of months.
inside Bahrain. We've seen time and time again how when the US administration or US presidents meet with dictators, meet with heads of oppressive regimes, what tends to happen is that it emboldens them. It reminds them that they can get away with committing acts of violence, with committing crimes, with committing human rights violations. Bahrain is a situation which I think is an interesting case study because it's one of the most well-documented cases of human rights violations in the region. It's a very small country, so having that kind of data is in some ways easier to track because of the numbers. Per capita, this is something that is little known of Bahrain. Per capita, Bahrain has one of the highest ratios of political prisoners in the region, and we know that they have a lot of competition in that department. And also, when you look back to 2011, Bahrain also had per capita some of the largest protests of the Arab Spring as well. During, and I'm referring here to points made in a letter that was actually sent to President Biden prior to his visit by several human rights organizations led by the Bahrain Institute for Rights and Democracy that is based in London. During the last year's Summit for Democracy, President Biden talked about how democracy around the world is, quote, essential to meeting the unprecedented challenges of our time. And he launched the Presidential Initiative for Democratic Renewal with the aim to bolster democratic reformers and to defend human rights globally. The visit of President Biden to the region today presents a U-turn on those promises. We cannot, in good conscience, think of President Biden meeting with the heads of these states and think that he will still follow through on these promises that have been made. And I think one of the easiest examples of that is that while the administration is going to the region to meet with dictators, to meet with people who have yet to be held accountable for the countless documented human rights violations and crimes that they have committed over decades, they have not taken the time to meet with civil society. Will President Biden, during his trip, actually make the time to go visit with political prisoners, with prisoners of conscience? Will he make the time to meet with the families of those who have either been killed or are currently serving time in prison? Will he meet with the human rights defenders who are currently living under travel ban or are unable to even live normal lives within their own countries? Those are the questions that really need to be asked during this visit. In Bahrain, we have upcoming elections in November, the parliamentary elections. Bahrain loves to always make a huge deal about these elections as an example of Bahrain doing a better job and, having some democratic institutions. What is important to point out is that the Bahraini parliament has no legislative or monitoring powers, which means that they exist for the mere purpose of showcasing, of PR strategy for the Bahraini regime. What happened last time we had elections in Bahrain is that we saw governments around the world, including in the West, coming out to welcome the elections that happened in Bahrain. This was not just disastrous in regards to the position of these governments on human rights and democracy, but it also, you can imagine the kind of message that it sends to the people of Bahrain, that your human rights do not matter. As a population, your governments matter, your monarchies matter, but you as a people, you don't exist. And unfortunately, as people from the Gulf, this has been the narrative and the discourse for a very long time. The way that we're depicted in the media, the way that we're depicted in Hollywood, the way that we're depicted in any conversation is that we as a people do not exist. Our monarchies exist. And this is incredibly traumatizing, amongst other things. There's no indication that there's any political will by the Bahraini government to take steps to actually releasing people or to better things for the upcoming elections. We're talking about an election where I already mentioned the parliament actually has no powers. But it's also happening in an environment where we have literally no independent media in the country. The only semi-independent newspaper was shut down several years ago. And where we have no opposition societies. Political opposition parties are banned, so we used to have opposition societies, and even those have been shut down, and many of their leaders are currently sitting in prison cells. And so we're looking at a parliamentary election where even opposition figures, or even people who used to be members of opposition societies, can no longer run. In addition, we're looking also at a situation where a lot of the leaders, whether political or human rights leaders, continue to sit in prison cells 11 years later. One of those people is my father. My father is, again, he should be a clear-cut case where This was supposed to be resolved ages ago. My father has been in prison now for 11 years. He's a human rights defender. He's world-renowned. The UN Committee on Arbitrary Detention issued a decision calling his detention arbitrary and calling for his release. Even the Bahraini government's own report, the Bahrain Independent Commission of Inquiry, documented the torture, the severe torture that my father was subjected to. He was subjected to severe physical, psychological, and sexual torture when he was arrested. He was held incommunicado for months where we didn't know if he was alive or dead, because when they arrested him and brutally beat him in front of my family, he was unconscious when they dragged him away. And after all of this, after the government recognized in their own report that my father had been brutally tortured, he continues to sit in a prison cell 11 years later. And I use my father's case not because he's the only political prisoner, not because he's the only prisoner of conscience or the only person who's been tortured. Actually, in Bahrain, torture is systematic, as is in all of our countries. He's also one of many hundreds, if not thousands, of prisoners of conscience across the region. But he's a case where, because it's so clear-cut that he was targeted for being a human rights defender, and because he carries an EU passport, you would have thought it would have been easier to get him out. Unfortunately, that has not been the case. He still sits in a prison cell 11 years later. We have also the case of Abdijalidas Case, who is a blogger and a human rights defender. He was already mentioned by Congressman McGovern as well. He's been on a hunger strike for over a year now, not demanding to be released as a prisoner of conscience. He is merely demanding that the books that he wrote in prison be handed over to his family. That's it. That is the only request that he has of this hunger strike. Not only are the Bahraini government refusing to do that, they're now denying him access to medical treatment, to the medicine that he needs to survive. And so we're very worried about his case. And I can bring you tons and tons of examples of these cases. But I think one case that is exemplary of what the situation is like in Bahrain is the case of Samim Shema. Samim Shema is someone that I personally met with and documented his case when I was in Bahrain during the uprising. I listened to him describe the horrific torture that he has been through, and I've documented tons of torture cases. His was one of the worst I've ever heard. He was then executed by the Bahraini government several years back, based on confessions extracted under torture. His brother is currently serving a life sentence. He's one of three sons. His brother is currently serving a life sentence. And his other brother was released after the several blows to the head under torture rendered him mentally incapacitated. So their mother now has lost 3 sons. Basically, this is what Bahrain is today. You see the flashy signs and the flashy PR campaigns of how Bahrain is doing better and how, our crown prince was educated right here in Washington, D.C. But the reality is that they use those as ways to justify or to make themselves look better, while the conditions on the ground get worse by the day, where they get worse for the people. If President Biden meets with the King of Bahrain, the message that sends to the King of Bahrain is that he's immune from accountability. If he meets with the King of Bahrain, the message that sends to the people of Bahrain is that their human rights and their democratic rights do not matter. That the Bahraini regime can continue to crack down, it can continue to oppress, it can continue to imprison people, and that can go unaccounted for. And unfortunately, that has been the case for years. I do want to say that there are several things that not just pertain to Bahrain, but to the region, when we talk about this visit to the Middle East. I also read President Biden's op-ed this weekend, and I thought that it was quite interesting that one of the things that did not come up in the op-ed was the importance of the human rights defenders in civil society. President Biden talked a lot about stability, about progress, about things getting better. He did talk about human rights, but he did not mention the human rights defenders. I always say this on any panel that I'm sitting on. If you want to know the human rights condition in any country, ask where their human rights defenders are. If they're in prison, if they're in exile, if they're under travel bans, that is not a country that respects human rights. That is not a country that can be considered a good and stable ally. Because what we've seen in 2011, we heard time and time again after the Arab Spring this idea that, but we were so shocked that the Arab Spring happened. We were so surprised. Where did this come from? It came out of left field that we suddenly had all these protests happening in the region. If people were talking to civil society on the ground, you would have known. Because we could have told you. We could have told you that this was decades in the making. People have been working for years to make sure that our human rights and our dignity is respected in our countries. But a lot of times that's missing. So what are some things that we can change? What are some things that the administration can actually do right now in support of human rights in the region? Releasing political prisoners and prisoners of conscience. I think that's a #1 step, not just in Bahrain, not just in Saudi, but across the region. With any head of state that Biden meets with, it is imperative that he brings up the cases of human rights defenders and of political prisoners still sitting in prison cells. But that's only a first step, because we live in countries where the system is the reason why they're in prison to begin with. If my father is released in Bahrain today, if Ala is released in Egypt, if Lajain has already been released, but there are other prisoners, even if they're released, there is no guarantee they will not be arrested again in a year, in a month, in a week, right? Because the system that put them in prison to begin with is the same system that exists. And therefore, yes, releases. Yes, people need to get out of prison. Yes, people need rehabilitation for the torture that they've been subjected to, but that we also need guarantees and reforms that make sure that people don't end up right back where they were. We also need accountability. We cannot look at reform, we cannot look at progress without talking about accountability. When we talk about accountability for torture, for the killings, for the kind of oppression that we've seen in the region, accountability is imperative. There needs to be requirements and restrictions on aid and on military sales when it comes to the region. This idea of, we're going to talk about human rights, we're going to talk about the importance of democracy and human rights as a cornerstone of foreign policy for the United States and for other countries in the West, but then we're also going to sell them weapons, no questions asked, we're also going to do deals and give them aid. That becomes, the whole talk about human rights becomes mere lip service. Because we reach a point where these governments understand that if they can withhold the talk, they will still get the things that they need to survive. Meeting with civil society. As I said before, it is imperative that the administration meets with civil society, not just in the respective countries, but also civil society abroad. People like us. Getting meetings with the president himself becomes important, because if he's going to listen to the people oppressing us, I think we deserve a right to be heard as well. When we have fake elections, fake and unfair elections in places like Bahrain, they should not be welcomed with open arms. There should be conversation around how they happened in situations where there is no free media, where there is no opposition societies. And then finally, and I'll end with this, I think it's incredibly important, we've seen this really well actually with the Gulf Cooperation Council countries. One thing that they do really well is that they work together. The GCC countries, whether it comes to Saudi Arabia or Bahrain or the UAE or otherwise, is that they present themselves as a package deal. You either do business with all of us or none of us. You either are an ally with all of us or none of us. And this is how they make sure that even Bahrain, that is economically suffering and not doing well, can still get the same kind of deals that Saudi Arabia can, that has a bit more leverage. What we need is people on the other side working together. When we see one government do the right thing, we need other governments to come around them and support it. We saw this in the case of Sweden, when they finally spoke out about women's rights in Saudi Arabia and suddenly were under attack by the entire GCC. Not a single other Western country came to their defense. Not a single one. Why is it that the oppressors do such a good job working together, and those who say they stand for democracy and human rights cannot figure out how to work together? That is really the question that needs to be asked. Thank you.
Thanks very much to all of our speakers for their really powerful remarks. And just to emphasize and kind of back up, Mariam was mentioning the need for this administration, for President Biden, to engage with powerful voices like those sitting here. And we have tried to convince the president to meet with activists and pro-human rights voices from the region. We encouraged them to do so instead of this visit, this trip, or prior to it, but they have not. And we hope that they will kind of change their mind and make time on the president's schedule for hearing these really important voices that offer a different and frankly much more accurate picture of the region than he's going to hear from the autocrats that he meets on Friday. We have some time for a couple of questions, if there are questions from the audience. Yep, Matt. We don't have a microphone, so just speak loud and clear, and I'll quickly summarize your question as well.
Hi, my name is Matt Gus. I'm a policy advisor for Senator Bernie Sanders.
Thanks very much, Matt. And just briefly, summarize, the question was, if you would like to comment on the Abraham Accords and the normalization with Israel and sort of that component of this trip and of this administration's priorities and kind of how you all see that as human rights defenders, human rights activists.
But like generally, I mean, the whole discourse I hear, it doesn't resonate with me as a person. When people talk about stability in Egypt, I know they're talking about regime stability. Like, it's very obvious that Egypt is an unstable country, but the Egyptian regime is very much stable. Why? Because of a lot of support from Western governments and from Gulf. But about the Abraham Accord and normalization, it's just like anything else that's being talked about. It's at the level of regimes talking together. It has nothing to do with what's happening on the ground. So it's alien.
What I might add is, you're right that it did not have popular support on the ground. I think part of it is that we don't have representative governments, right? We don't have governments that actually ask for the opinion of the people whenever they make decisions. And I think that it says everything that you need to know in regards to what the standing within the country is. The other thing that I'll mention is that we have seen time and time again, even before the normalization deals, we saw how there was use of security equipment that was bought from Israel as part of the oppression in Bahrain. And so for us as activists, when we heard that these deals were happening, our first panic was, what more are they going to be able to procure in weapons and tools that have been tested on the Palestinian population that are now going to be used against us as well. And I myself personally have been targeted by spyware. I'm pretty sure we all have, as have our family members. And that spyware, much of it comes from Israel. And so for us, that's what we think about when we think about these deals, is that they're going to become even more equipped in our oppression. They're going to become even more equipped in their crackdown against our populations. And so I think that's where the conversation also needs to be, is that where do you put those limitations? Where is the conversations around human rights safeguards when it comes to the selling and procurement of tools of oppression?
Thanks. We have time for another question, if there's another question from the audience. And also, let me just say, thank you, Matt, to you and to Senator Sanders for your support on these issues, and thanks for your comments and support today. So. We have one last question. If not, then, yeah, here in the front, go ahead.
Are there any bills in the House that you're aware of that you are supportive of or in opposition or want to bring up?
The question is if there are pieces of legislation in the House or Senate that you all would like to sort of call for support.
Where's that? Yeah. I think Seth would be the best person to answer that question. I know that there was, I believe there was a bill that was, and I might be saying this wrong, but to the best of my memory, and my memory is not great these days, but from what I remember, there was a bill to stop the selling of arms to Bahrain in the past months that was happening. And I think that, generally, of course, we support bills that would put human rights framework and human rights conditions on any arms sales to any government in the region and across the world, not just Bahrain. But yeah, that's the one that is off the top of my head. But yeah, Seth would be the person to ask.
There will be also a conversation soon about the 130 million that were withheld of aid from Egypt. Of course, they're very, very symbolic because they were a small ratio, but they were withheld for human rights conditions that weren't improved. And so we at least hope that, although the step was very symbolic, that they will keep withholding this aid until the conditions they put are improved.
Thanks. And I'll just briefly comment. I think that there are lots of opportunities for constructive legislation. there's the annual appropriation process that's underway now, as to back up what Miriam said, I mean, I think we have long advocated for, a dramatic reduction, if not elimination, of arms sales to repressive autocrats in the region. And frankly, I believe that the existing U.S. law requires that, but is not followed by the administration. There's language in the Arms Export Control Act and in the Foreign Assistance Act that prohibits the sale of any weapons to governments that have exhibit a clear pattern of abuse of human rights, and that applies to certainly the governments of the three countries that our speakers are representing here today, as well as most of the other governments whose rulers President Biden will be meeting on Friday. And without going into kind of other detail, please, refer you to our website and reports that we put out in terms of other legislation to support. With that, I'd like to thank you all once again for coming, and please join me in thanking our courageous speakers for their voices today. Thank you. Yeah, you did a great job.